June 24th, 1991. Boarhills, Scotland. The body of 33-year-old Sandy Drummond is found on a farm track across the road from his cottage, and it is determined that he was choked to death with a ju-jitsu stranglehold. In the days prior to his death, Sandy had suddenly quit his job without notice and withdrew nearly all of his money from his accounts, leading to speculation that someone may have been bullying or blackmailing him. Investigators explore a number of different leads, including sightings of an orange car parked outside Sandy's cottage before he was killed, but the murder remains unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week we're going to be traveling back across the Atlantic to Scotland to explore a very bizarre cold case, the 1991 murder of Sandy Drummond. Over the years, I've received a couple of requests to cover this one, and I can honestly say that I've never seen another crime like it, as this particular victim was choked to death by what was described as a ju-jitsu stranglehold. Sandy Drummond was known as a quiet but pleasant man who shared a cottage with his brother and maintained a close relationship with his family, but while he was considered to be a reliable employee at a local paper mill, his life took a strange turn when he suddenly decided to quit without notice, even though he did not have another job lined up. While details are vague, it's been reported that Sandy had become the target of bullying and harassment at his workplace, and since he would go on to withdraw nearly all of the money from his accounts, there's been speculation that Sandy had some sort of dark secret and was being blackmailed for it. But curiously, all of this money was found inside Sandy's cottage following his murder, so robbery did not appear to be the motive for the crime. In the hours prior to his death, there would be a number of strange details which have not been satisfactorily explained, such as an eyewitness sighting of Sandy leaving his cottage and running across the road with a blue hold-all bag which was never found or accounted for. Numerous witnesses would recall seeing an orange car which appeared to be a Morris Marina parked outside Sandy's cottage that day, but while it's reasonable to assume that the owner of this vehicle may have been involved in Sandy's death, they have never been identified. You get the sense that this might be one of those mysteries where certain people in the community have a pretty good idea about what happened, but have kept their mouths shut for decades, allowing the case to remain unsolved. The whole thing almost seems like a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces don't quite fit together, so we're definitely going to have a lot to discuss and analyze on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 80 exclusive bonus episodes and archives which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the murder of Sandy Drummond. Our story begins in Scotland in 1991, and our central figure is 33-year-old Alexander Lack Drummond, who goes by the name Sandy. Ever since he was a boy, Sandy wanted to be an engineer, and since he figured that the best way to achieve that goal was through a military apprenticeship, he decided to join an infantry unit called the Black Watch 3rd Battalion Royal Regiment of Scotland. After spending 3 years stationed in Northern Ireland, Sandy decided to return to Scotland following his discharge in order to be closer to his family. At this particular point, Sandy currently lives in Boarhills, a small hamlet located in the Fife Council area, which has a population of only 80 people, and both he and his older brother Jim Drummond reside at the No. 2 cottage at Fallside Farm, which runs along the A915 road. He is known for being a quiet, shy, and solitary person who loves to spend time running and riding his motorcycle through the countryside, but he is also described as having a pleasant personality and being very willing to open up to people once he got to know them. Sandy also maintains a very close relationship with his parents, Effie and Alexander Drummond Sr., who live nearby. Sadly, Alexander Sr. is suffering from dementia, but Sandy often stays at his parents' residence to help care for him, and has even paid for his mother to go on vacation whenever she needs a break. Sandy was also known for generously donating to charity and once gave an entire week's worth of wages to cancer research. For the past 7 years, Sandy has worked as a laborer at the Guardbridge paper mill located just outside the nearby town of St. Andrews, which is about 5 miles from Sandy's cottage. Sandy was always described as being a steady and dependable employee, but shortly before 2:30 p.m. on the afternoon of Friday, June the 21st, Sandy took everyone by complete surprise when he phoned up his boss and announced that he was immediately quitting his job and would not be returning to work, as he was unwilling to even provide a suitable notice period. 1 hour later, at around 3:30 p.m., a married couple who knew Sandy personally said that they saw him in downtown St. Andrews, where he parked his motorcycle and started speaking with a young man. This man was described as being in his early 20s and about 5'7" with a slim build, but as far as I can tell, he was never identified, and the context of his conversation with Sandy is unknown. On the evening of Sunday, June the 23rd, Sandy had dinner at his parents' residence in Boarhills and informed them that he had quit his job, but he never provided an explanation why, and he also did not have another job lined up. His mother Effie would later reveal that over the course of the previous month, Sandy's behavior had drastically changed as he became more withdrawn, and it seemed apparent that something was bothering him. Sandy had recently been transferred to a new department at the paper mill, but his mother suspected that he was being bullied or harassed by his coworkers, which could have motivated his abrupt decision to quit. After finishing dinner, Sandy left his parents' place on his motorcycle, and Effie saw him riding away in the distance, but while she assumed he would head back home by turning left at the nearest intersection, she was surprised to see him turn right instead. And unfortunately, this would turn out to be the last time Effie saw her son alive. In retrospect, it seemed apparent that Sandy took a brief detour, as bank records would later show that £250 was withdrawn from Sandy's account at an ATM at a Bank of Scotland branch in St. Andrews at 7:22 p.m. By 8 o'clock, Sandy had returned to his cottage, where he finally told his brother Jim that he had quit his job at the paper mill. Even though Jim was left surprised by this news, he said that Sandy appeared to be in good spirits. Sandy also told Jim he was thinking about sneaking away for a few days, and asked Jim if he would be willing to allow him to borrow his car for this if he left his motorcycle behind. Jim agreed to the request, and Sandy also asked his brother if he could wake him up when he left for work the following morning. Well, at around 7:20 a.m. on Monday, June the 24th, Jim woke up Sandy as promised before he headed out, but over the course of the next several hours, a bizarre series of events would unfold, which have still never been adequately explained. When Jim returned home from work at 6 p.m. that evening, he said that Sandy was not there, but he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary and left the cottage again a short time later. However, at around 8 p.m., a local resident was going for a walk on a farm track located on the opposite side of the A915 when he came across Sandy's body. The spot was only 200 yards from Sandy's cottage, and he was lying face down with his arms beneath his stomach. The Fife police were soon summoned to the scene, and when they examined Sandy's body, they could find no physical marks or any noticeable signs of foul play, aside from some small bruises and contusions. In fact, the police initially wondered if Sandy's death might have been a suicide or the result of some sort of medical issue, as it almost appeared as if he had been clutching his stomach when he died. Sandy's parents and his brother were soon informed about his death, but did not receive any real explanation for how it happened, as the police would only classify it as quote-unquote suspicious. However, when Sandy's autopsy was performed, the pathologist discovered that he had suffered serious neck trauma and ruled that he was the victim of foul play. He confirmed that Sandy had been killed by what he described as the quote-unquote perfect execution of a Japanese stranglehold, and it was later reclassified as a ju-jitsu stranglehold, as the perpetrator had likely applied a rear-naked choke to Sandy from behind, which constricted his arteries and jugular veins and cut off the flow of blood to his brain before he died. But even though the pathologist made this ruling relatively quickly, it would be 4 months before the Fife police informed Sandy's family that he had been murdered and publicly announced that a homicide investigation was being launched. Naturally, the crime left everyone completely perplexed because as far as anyone could tell, Sandy did not have any known enemies, and a ju-jitsu stranglehold was such an unusual manner of death. Regardless, investigators attempted to track Sandy's movements after he was last seen by his brother on the morning of June 24th. Well, it turned out that at approximately 7:25 a.m., only about 5 minutes after Jim left for work, a motorist driving on the A915 reported having seen Sandy emerge from his cottage and run across the road into a field, which was located next to the track where his body would be found just over 12 hours later. The motorist also said that Sandy was carrying a blue hold-all bag under his arm, and while his family confirmed that Sandy did own a bag matching this description, it could not be found in the cottage following his death and was never accounted for. Later that morning, right before 11 a.m., CCTV footage captured Sandy entering the Dunfermline Building Society on Market Street in St. Andrews, where he withdrew more money and nearly emptied out his entire savings account. Combined with the money he had gotten from the ATM the previous evening, Sandy withdrew a total of nearly £850. But curiously, nearly all this money would be found at Sandy's cottage, which seemed to rule out robbery as being the motive for his murder, and no one knew why he made these withdrawals in the first place. Technically, this final withdrawal would be the last official confirmed sighting of Sandy, though later that afternoon at around 4 p.m., a motorist recalled seeing a man fitting Sandy's description jogging along the road near his cottage. While the man was never positively identified as being Sandy, this was something he ordinarily did. Well, about 45 minutes later, numerous motorists who passed by Sandy's cottage on the A915 reported seeing what they described as a rusty red or orange car parked outside, and they saw 2 people speaking to each other through the living room window. Jim was still at work at this point, and the rusty car was no longer parked there by the time he returned home. However, sometime between 7:10 and 7:15 p.m., after Jim left again, another witness reported seeing a red hatchback car parked in reverse at the bottom end of the farm track where Sandy's body was eventually found. Around the same time period, there would also be a sighting of a silver-green Renault 5 hatchback car parked on a bridge near the cottage, and 2 men would emerge from it and jump off a 9-foot wall next to the road before they ran through a field in the direction of the farm track. However, neither these 2 men nor any of the aforementioned vehicles could be identified. Sandy's family suspected that he may have been blackmailed, which could have explained why he chose to withdraw all the money from his accounts, and his mother Effie even wondered if this played a role in his decision to quit his job at the paper mill without notice. However, investigators questioned all of Sandy's co-workers, as well as his fellow infantrymen from his service in the Black Watch, but they were unable to turn up any compelling leads. At around 4:20 a.m. on New Year's Day in 1992, a man called the Fife police station and said, quote, "I'm John and I killed Sandy Drummond," before abruptly hanging up. The police spent around 30 hours investigating this lead before they finally traced the call to a 25-year-old St. Andrews resident named John Conahan, but it turned out that the whole thing was nothing more than a hoax, and Conahan wound up receiving a 60-day jail sentence for wasting the police's time. In February of that year, Sandy's murder would be profiled on an episode of the popular BBC program Crime Watch UK in hopes that someone watching might have important information and come forward. The episode revealed that at around 7 p.m. on June the 23rd, the night before Sandy was killed, there had been an eyewitness sighting of him walking down a road in Boarhills. But I'm not sure if this sighting was ever officially verified since bank records show that Sandy withdrew 250 pounds from an ATM in St. Andrews at 7:22 p.m. that night, even though the ATM was located 5 miles in the opposite direction. The Crime Watch episode did lead to around 30 calls from viewers, but it didn't bring the case any closer to a resolution. Since Fife was an area not known for experiencing much violent crime, Sandy's murder was pretty much the biggest case their police force had ever investigated, and in total, there were over 16,000 hours worked, as well as 600 statements and interviews. However, Effie Drummond was always an outspoken critic of the Fife Police's investigation, as she believed they made a number of mistakes, so she attempted to contact Police Scotland's Chief Constable, her local MPs, and even Great Britain's Prime Minister, John Major, to seek assistance. In response, Crown officials in Edinburgh agreed to order a special public inquiry into Sandy's death under the Fatal Accidents and Sudden Deaths Act, marking one of the first times this act was used to investigate an unsolved murder. This inquiry took place at Cooper Sheriff Court in September of 1992, and during his testimony, the pathologist who performed Sandy's autopsy was very critical of the Fife Police for not noticing any signs of foul play on Sandy when they discovered him on the farm track, as they did not treat the spot as a crime scene and moved his body before a full forensic examination could be performed. In response, Douglas Potter, the former chief superintendent of the Fife Police, testified that Sandy's solitary lifestyle made it very difficult to investigate his death because even though he did not have any known enemies, Sandy did not have any particularly close friends either. Potter stated, quote, "Out of the hundreds of lines of inquiry we pursued, we never managed to establish that he had a single friend," end quote. It was confirmed that police did find evidence that Sandy had been experiencing a rough time at the Garbridge paper mill in the months prior to his death and was possibly being bullied by his coworkers. In fact, on the night before he was killed, Sandy supposedly wrote down the names of the employees who gave him the most trouble, though it could not be established if this had any connection to his death. At the conclusion of the inquiry, the Fife Police announced that they were going to perform a fresh review of Sandy's case with new investigators, but the crime continued to remain unsolved. The death of her son left a devastating effect on Effie, as she reported receiving strange phone calls and experiencing break-ins at her residence. She told the press, quote, "My life now is agony. The strain makes me feel 1,000 years old," end quote. In June of 1995, Effie passed away at the age of 67, and 4 years later, her husband Alexander would follow suit when he died at the age of 78. Their surviving son Jim summarized the whole situation when he stated, quote, "From the day Sandy died, it ran my mother's life. It probably killed her in the end. It was the lack of answers that really frustrated her. Mom was still looking for answers until the day she died," end quote. Well, in September of 1998, Sandy's case would once again be featured on Crime Watch UK as part of their Still Unsolved series and publicly revealed some new leads. I previously made mention of sightings of a rusty red or orange car which had been seen outside Sandy's cottage on the day of his murder, but after a more extensive investigation, police were now convinced that the vehicle was an orange Morris Marina. Investigators had since spoken to a witness named Rosie Hutchinson, who had frequently passed by the cottage on the A915 during her bus route back and forth to her job in St. Andrews in 1991. Hutchinson claimed that in April and May of that year, in the months prior to Sandy's death, she noticed an orange Morris Marina parked outside the cottage on several occasions. Hutchinson said she would see it there in the late morning and late afternoon hours, and that it had a child on board sticker in the back window. If Hutchinson's sightings were accurate, then this suggested that the owner of the marina was acquainted with Sandy and had visited his cottage numerous times. The other intriguing new lead was the sighting of a man who appeared to be in his mid-30s, who waved down a bus while standing along the A915 next to Sandy's cottage at around 2:30 p.m. on the date of the murder. After he boarded the bus, the man requested that he be dropped off in St. Andrews, and the driver noticed that he was carrying a handkerchief which appeared to be bloodstained. As the driver pulled away, he claimed that he also noticed what appeared to be an orange Morris Marina parked across the road from Sandy's cottage on the same farm track where his body would be found several hours later. The bus then drove to St. Andrews, and the unidentified man was dropped off at a housing project on Lamont Drive. While it could not be established if this man had any connection to Sandy's murder, the police still wanted to track him down and question him, but he was never identified. The Crime Watch UK episode also revealed for the first time that the orange Marina parked outside Sandy's cottage that afternoon was seen pulling away at around 4:45 p.m. Unfortunately, the release of this new information did not pave the way to any new leads, and the investigation continued to remain at a standstill. In March of 2016, Police Scotland publicly announced that a new cold case review was going to be performed on Sandy's murder, as they hoped that advances in forensic science might help solve the case. They sent out another public appeal for information and would later say that they got an excellent response, as Detective Chief Inspector Maxine Martin told the press, quote, "I believe that the answers to Sandy's death lie in the local community," end quote. However, around this same time period, an investigative journalist named Michael Mulford publicly revealed that he had gotten access to some older case notes and learned that police had identified a serious suspect in Sandy's murder, but when they went to interview him, they discovered that he had passed away. But since police felt this suspect may have had one or more accomplices when he killed Sandy, they were going to keep the investigation open. In response, Police Scotland refused to confirm or deny if Mulford's statement was true, only that the case was under quote-unquote ongoing review. In October of 2022, Sandy's story would be featured on an episode of the BBC true crime series David Wilson's Crime Files, hosted by noted Scottish criminologist David Wilson. Crime writer Douglas Skelton was featured on the episode and speculated that Sandy may have been killed because he was quote-unquote harboring a dark sexual secret. Skelton stated, quote, "He changed from this happy person, this person who was interested in nature and wildlife and astronomy, and he became sad, I think is the only word to use," end quote. For the first time, Skelton revealed that he had spoken to Effie Drummond on numerous occasions before she died, and she once recounted a story where Sandy broke down in tears while they were conversing. Even though Effie begged her son to open up about what was bothering him, he said he could not do so because it was, quote-unquote, too filthy. In spite of this, investigators have always maintained that they never uncovered any dark secrets in Sandy's background, as one source described him as, quote-unquote, clean as the archangel Gabriel. Whatever the case, over 3 decades have now passed, and the murder of Sandy Drummond continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So after doing this podcast for 9.5 years and analyzing hundreds of cold cases, I wouldn't expect to come across a crime featuring a manner of death I've never seen before, but the murder of Sandy Drummond is the first unsolved case I've seen in which a victim was choked to death with a ju-jitsu stranglehold. This involves sneaking up behind the victim and wrapping one's arms around their neck in order to cut off the flow of blood and oxygen to their brain. It's a method of murder in which the perpetrator can avoid leaving any noticeable marks or physical evidence behind, and even if they left traces of their DNA on Sandy's head and neck, I seriously doubt that the police would have collected it back in 1991. This is why the Fife police were not even certain that Sandy's death was a homicide at first, and treated it as a potential suicide or fatal medical issue. Of course, you also have to be a pretty strong person in order to pull this off, and the identity of the perpetrator and the circumstances which led to them murdering Sandy in this fashion are quite a baffling mystery. This is a very heartbreaking story because even though Sandy was described as being a quiet and solitary person, it sounds like he would go out of his way to help those he cared about, such as his decision to help care for his father while he was suffering from dementia and pay for his mother to take vacations if she ever needed a break from this. It sounds like Sandy's mother Effie was left completely devastated by his death, and before she passed away herself a few years later, she had to fight diligently for Sandy to receive a proper investigation. But in retrospect, it now seems like Sandy may have been harboring a dark secret that he could not share with Effie and potentially played a role in his murder. While Effie herself never openly confirmed this, it sounds like she had a very emotional conversation with her son in the months prior to his death, in which it was apparent that something was bothering Sandy, but he couldn't tell his mother about it because it was, quote-unquote, too filthy. And given that Sandy abruptly quit his job at the Garbridge paper mill only 3 days before he was killed, and had reportedly been bullied by his co-workers, this has led to speculation that he was being blackmailed over his so-called filthy secret. Naturally, it's been theorized that this secret was sexual in nature, and given that I've never heard anything about Sandy having been in a relationship with a woman, it's possible that he may have been gay. Now, I certainly don't want to refer to a secret like that as dark and filthy, but that may have been the mindset for many people living in a small Scottish hamlet back in 1991. But if Sandy was in the closet, could this mean that his murder was a hate crime? The police have always acted like they failed to turn up any secrets in Sandy's background which shed any light on potential motives for his death, but they have also never officially confirmed if these rumors about him being bullied at the paper mill are true. It's been reported that they interviewed all of Sandy's co-workers, and he apparently wrote down a list of the employees who were giving him the most trouble, but if investigators considered any of these people to be potential suspects, they've never said so. However, law enforcement in the United Kingdom has always been known for being more tight-lipped than American law enforcement when it comes to sharing information about open cold case investigations with the public, so I think there's a good chance that they have learned more than they are letting on. In 2016, investigative journalist Michael Mulford publicly announced that he had uncovered information about police identifying a promising suspect who has since passed away, but since this person may have had accomplices, the investigation was being kept open. That could very well be true, but investigators have refused to confirm or deny this. I don't know if one person killed Sandy on their own, or if there were others present when it happened, but at the very least, you'd expect that there might be others in the community who have key information or know something but have stayed silent about it. What seems indisputable is that something was clearly bothering Sandy in the days prior to his death, and while it appears that numerous details about this case may have been withheld from the public, the authorities have done a fairly solid job at establishing a timeline of Sandy's movements before he was killed, though there are a number of things which don't make much sense. Of course, the strangeness all started 3 days before Sandy's murder, when he suddenly decided to quit his job at the mill, and he refused to give them a notice period or even quit in person, instead deciding to offer his resignation over the telephone. Given that Sandy had worked there for 7 years and was described as a very reliable employee, and he quit without having another job lined up, this indicates that things must have gotten seriously bad for him, and he may have been too fearful to return there for 1 second, even to settle his affairs. Once again, I'd really love to learn more information about what kind of bullying and harassment that Sandy was supposedly facing, and if investigators believe it was connected to his murder. We know that at around 3:30 p.m. on Friday, June the 22nd, about an hour after Sandy's phone call, a couple who knew him personally said that they saw him parking his motorcycle in St. Andrews and conversing with a young man in his 20s. I have not heard anything about this young man being identified, and while it's possible that Andy's conversation with them was nothing more than a random, mundane encounter which has no relevance to this case, I can't overlook the significance of this taking place so soon after Sandy decided to quit. Unfortunately, we don't have any information about Sandy's whereabouts over the course of the weekend until he had dinner with his parents at their residence in Boarhills on the evening of Sunday the 24th and left at 6:30 p.m. After that, he presumably rode his motorbike into St. Andrews in order to withdraw £250 from an ATM at 7:22 p.m. before heading back to his cottage. Unlike when he made a withdrawal the following day, it does not sound like there was any CCTV footage to capture this transaction, and while there would ordinarily be no reason to believe that anyone else but Sandy withdrew that money, there was apparently a witness who reported seeing Sandy walking through Boarhills at around 7 o'clock. So could this mean that Sandy gave his ATM card to someone else to withdraw the money? Well, I am inclined to believe that the witness who saw Sandy in Boarhills was mistaken, and we know that he returned to St. Andrews to pretty much clean out his accounts at the Dunfermline Building Society the following morning. My theory is that Sandy may have been planning to do this on Sunday night, but the ATM had a daily limit for how much money he could withdraw. And since the Building Society would have been closed at that point, Sandy had to go back there in order to make a larger withdrawal, and in total, he wound up taking out nearly £850. The most prominent theory for these transactions is that Sandy was being blackmailed about his so-called dark secret, but since the money he withdrew was found in his cottage following his death, robbery was clearly not the motive for the crime. However, this doesn't preclude the idea of Sandy being blackmailed and making an attempt to pay someone off, but they had no interest in the money and decided to kill him anyway. The other potential explanation is that Sandy needed this money because he was planning to skip town, as after he made his initial ATM withdrawal, Sandy returned home and told his brother Jim that he wanted to sneak away for a few days. Even so, I don't think Sandy would have needed to empty his accounts for a brief vacation, so he may have been planning to take off permanently, and given how close he was to his family, I can only imagine what would drive Sandy to believe he needed to do that. Sandy also waited 2 days before even telling his brother that he quit his job, so I really have no idea what was going on in his mind at that point. The weirdest detail in this case, which has never made any sense, is the eyewitness sighting from the motorist who claimed he saw Sandy leaving his cottage and running across the road into a field the following morning while carrying a blue hold-all bag. While you could assume that this witness was mistaken, the timeline does fit, as Sandy had asked Jim to wake him up before he headed off to work, and this sighting took place at 7:25 a.m., only about 5 minutes after Jim left. Sandy's family also confirmed that he did own a blue hold-all bag matching that description, which could not be found following his death. The fact that Sandy grabbed this bag and ran across the road so soon after Jim left the cottage seems to indicate that he was desperate to do something that morning which he did not want his brother finding out about. Since the £850 was eventually found, and most of it was not even withdrawn until after this sighting took place, I don't believe the money was in the hold-all bag. So what did the bag contain, and why did Sandy feel he needed to take it across the road into a field at that time of the morning? The field was right next to the farm track where Sandy was found dead later that evening, so I do have to wonder if there's a connection. But if Sandy gave that bag to someone else, what did they do with it? I'd also be curious to know Sandy's whereabouts over the course of the next 3.5 hours before he showed up at the Building Society to make his next withdrawal at 11 a.m. After that, it seems like the only other reported sighting of Sandy was when a man matching his description was seen jogging down the A915 near his cottage at around 4 p.m., and while this was something Sandy ordinarily did, I don't believe this sighting was positively verified as being him. So technically, we really don't know what went on during that 9-hour window between when Sandy visited the Building Society at 11 a.m. and he was found dead at 8 p.m. But we certainly have a number of odd sightings which took place during that time period. One key detail which was not made public until 1998 was the sighting of an unidentified young man who boarded a bus right next to Sandy's cottage at around 2:30 that afternoon while carrying a bloody handkerchief. I'm not entirely convinced this man had any connection to Sandy's murder, since his body was not found for another 5.5 hours, and since Sandy was choked to death, there was no blood found at the scene. So unless this guy wound up cutting himself while attacking Sandy, this bloody handkerchief may be connected to a completely unrelated event. There's also the fact that the bus driver reported seeing an orange Morris Marina parked across the road from Sandy's cottage as he was pulling away. It's been suspected that this Marina was connected to Sandy's murder, but if the young man was involved in the crime, why would he be leaving the scene on a bus while the car was parked right there? So we have multiple eyewitness sightings of the orange Marina being parked at the other side of the road right next to Sandy's cottage sometime before 4:45 that afternoon, and if the driver of this vehicle was involved in the murder, I wonder if he initially parked on the farm track because he wanted to avoid being seen by the guy waiting for the bus, and then decided to drive across the road after the bus left. Some of the motorists who saw the marina claim that they also noticed two people speaking with each other inside the cottage through the living room window, though it sounds like they did not get a good enough look to confirm if one of them was Sandy. At least one witness reported seeing the marina pulling away from the cottage at 4:45, and since Sandy was not there when Jim returned home from work at 6 o'clock, you have to wonder if Sandy was inside the marina when it left, though whether he was leaving voluntarily or against his will, or was possibly already dead at that point, is still a mystery. After all, police have not discounted the possibility that Sandy was killed at another location before the responsible party dumped his body on the farm track. It's interesting to compare the two separate Crime Watch UK segments about this case from 1992 and 1998, because in the first segment, the police simply described this vehicle as a rusted red or orange car. But by the time of the second segment, it appears that they were certain it was an orange Morris Marina, and their conclusion was likely influenced by the new eyewitness account from Rosie Hutchinson, who claimed she saw this marina parked outside Sandy's cottage multiple times during her bus routes to and from work during April and May of 1991. Now, I can tell you that I'm not someone who would ordinarily remember random parked cars I saw on my commute to work, but an orange Morris Marina is a very distinctive looking vehicle, and it also apparently had a child on board sign in the back window, so I'm guessing this is why Rosie Hutchinson had a vivid recollection of it, and why police deemed her account to be credible. But of course, if the owner of this marina made multiple visits to Sandy's cottage in the months prior to his death, then you can look at this case in an entirely different light. As far as I can tell, Jim Drummond seemed to have no recollection of this car or had any idea who it belonged to, so I have to assume that he wasn't at home on any of the occasions where the owner of the marina went there. What's also odd is that Hutchinson's sighting seemed to take place during the late morning or late afternoon hours, which you would think was a time period when Sandy was working at the paper mill, though I don't know his exact schedule. But I can't overlook that so many different witnesses reported seeing the same vehicle outside Sandy's cottage at many different times, so I feel it has to have some sort of connection to what ultimately happened to him. I don't want to speculate too much, but there have apparently been rumors that Sandy was gay, and if he was having a secret affair with someone, perhaps this person made multiple visits to the cottage while Sandy's brother was not home. And even if the owner of the marina was not directly involved in Sandy's murder, this sort of secret could very well compel them to stay silent and not come forward, even if they had important information. However, the thing that troubles me is that an orange Morris Marina is a distinct-looking car, so if someone living in the area had a vehicle matching that description, it is surprising that police wouldn't have been able to track it down. Was there anyone who did own a vehicle like that, but they were investigated and ruled out as a suspect? We also have two more reported vehicle sightings in the area, which took place in the hour prior to the discovery of Sandy's body. One of them was initially described as a red hatchback, which was seen parked in reverse between 7:10 and 7:15 p.m. at the bottom end of the farm track where he was eventually found. It's not clear to me if police believe this is the marina, because during the initial reporting of the case, the car seen outside Sandy's cottage that day was described as a rusted red or orange car before it was positively identified as an orange Morris Marina years later. During the early evening hours, I suppose that a witness could mistake an orange-colored car for a red one, but regardless of whether this vehicle was the same marina, the fact that it was parked on the track at that particular time is a strong indicator that someone may have been killing Andy a few hundred yards away or were dumping his body there. If that wasn't enough, we had another sighting during this time period of two men parking a silver-green Renault 5 on a nearby bridge and jumping off a 9-foot wall before running in the direction of the track. It's very unlikely that this particular vehicle would be mistaken for an orange Marina, so were these two guys involved in Andy's murder? The presence of all these different people and vehicles near the crime scene does suggest that multiple individuals were involved in what happened. It's really hard to figure out how the pieces of this puzzle fit together, and since investigators have never revealed what they believe is an exact time of death for Sandy, it's unclear how long he may have been lying out on that track before he was discovered. I have my doubts that Sandy was killed inside his cottage, as I don't believe Jim noticed any signs of violence or foul play when he returned there at 6 p.m., but was Sandy already lying dead across the road by that point? If he was still alive, then where was he? Even if Sandy was killed a short time before he was found at 8 p.m., we still don't know how he got to that particular spot to begin with, or how these events might have unfolded. Now, the big unanswered question we're left with in this case is whether law enforcement has their own idea about what happened and who was responsible. Like I mentioned earlier, Michael Mulford has claimed that he saw some old case notes where police zeroed in on a prime suspect and were all ready to interview him until they learned he passed away, but they were still going to keep the investigation open since accomplices may have been involved. Obviously, even if a suspect dies, the police can still publicly name them as the killer if they feel the evidence would have been strong enough to make an arrest if they were still alive. But I'm doubting that's a possibility here, and while there are many cold cases which have been solved in recent years, when genetic genealogy and forensic evidence posthumously linked a deceased suspect to the crime, it does not sound like there is any physical evidence to work with in this case at all. To this day, the authorities have never confirmed or denied if what Mulford said is true, but I can understand them not wanting to tip their hand if there is an individual or multiple individuals out there who can still be charged for their involvement in this crime. If Sandy's death was connected to bullying or harassment at his workplace, or he was the victim of a blackmail scheme, then I am inclined to believe that he was not killed by a lone perpetrator, and there may be a code of silence surrounding what happened involving multiple people. But with the information I have right now, I couldn't tell you the motive for Sandy's murder or the circumstances which led to him being killed in such an unusual fashion. Without much in the way of forensic evidence, it seems that the best chance we have of this case being solved is for someone to make a confession or come forward with what they know. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Sandy Drummond, please contact the Fife Police. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released another one of my cinema-themed episodes titled 10 Underrated Crime Films, in which I discuss some of my favorite crime movies which I consider to be overlooked. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chili, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the story of the Hatbox Baby, an abandoned infant who was supposedly found in the Arizona desert on Christmas Eve in 1931. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Stacy B, Emily, and LM. Thank you all so much for your support. I also wanted to mention for the final time that in just over 1 week from now, The Trail Went Cold will be appearing on Podcast Row at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place in Boston, Massachusetts at the DoubleTree by Hilton Hotel Boston North Shore from July the 18th to the 20th. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code you can use to get a 20% discount on them. So please visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use the promo code ROBIN20 to get 20% off tickets. Once again, visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and the promo code is ROBIN20 for 20% off. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. Anyway, like I just mentioned, I'm going to be at the True Crime Podcast Festival next weekend, and per tradition, whenever I attend one of these podcasting events, I always like to cover an unsolved cold case from the event's host city, which means I'm going to be tackling a case from the Boston area. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.